Talking to Dr. Michael Barbour. He is at Sacred Heart University and he researches K-12 online learning and all the configurations. Dr. Barbour, I have two questions. My first is, what are trends that you're seeing in K-12 blended and online learning in the U.S.? Like, where are we and where might we be heading?
Well, it's interesting that you say specifically in the U.S. because the U.S. environment is actually very different than any of the other environments when we're looking at online and blended learning, at least from a field perspective. Online and blended learning in the U.S. has really sort of been coupled together, whereas outside of the U.S. we tend to talk about online learning mainly at a distance. Blended learning oftentimes gets talked about as technology integration or some form of e-learning, and that e-learning goes on a spectrum from just basic technology integration to offering courses completely online within a local geographic context. But within the US, we've seen those two terms really sort of intermingled, and I think that's largely due to many of the advocacy groups that have been pushing in this field, organizations like iNACOL and the Christensen Institute, even the Evergreen Education Group. And where we are right now, I mean, online learning as a means of delivery has been around for 2.5 decades at this point. Blended learning, depending on how you define it, has probably been around just as long, although we've really only started calling it that in the past decade. And again, that's largely due to those advocacy groups. Depending upon whose figures you look at, anywhere between about 5 to 6% of all K-12 students are learning in an online environment. That could be as high as up to 14 to 18%, again, depending upon whose statistics you're using there. And it's a growing phenomenon. It's growing considerably. Sorry, I didn't know if you were trying to jump in there.
Oh, no, that's huge. That's a big difference, like 5 to 18, wow.
Yeah, and I mean, but we do know that it is growing. I mean, if you look, when the first person that bothered to count this was Tom Clark back in 2000, 2001 as part of his State of the States report, and he estimated at the time that there were between 40 and 50,000 students in the United States that were learning at a distance. Even the most conservative estimates right now say that number is probably somewhere in the 1.5 to 2 million range. So, we've seen a real exponential growth, although that growth, at least with the online component, is starting to level off a fair amount. Part of that is due to regulatory environments. We had a great explosion, a great opening, if you will. At least that's the language that a lot of these neoliberal advocacy groups would use, an opening of markets for, supplemental and in particular full-time programs that are often run by these for-profit cyber charters. Although that tends to be leveling off right now, and what we've seen is a real growth in these hybrid or blended programs in the last few years. One of the difficulties with all of this is that when it comes to student performance in this kind of environment, it's still not a good picture. The research that we have in the supplemental environment tends to tell us that, our best and brightest students will continue to be our best and brightest students. Unfortunately, those students that are sort of the middle of the road students, or more of our at-risk credit recovery type students, they struggle in high numbers in the supplemental environment. When it comes to the full-time environment, even though based upon the best data that we have, these full-time programs tend to over-enroll a higher class of student, a higher ability level of student. These online programs, these full-time online programs, tend to perform at much, much lower levels than what their brick and mortar counterparts do. And regardless if it's some of the more progressive organizations like the National Education Policy Center, or more of the sort of educational reform friendly neoliberal organizations like Credo out of Stanford University, they've all found that, full-time online programs actually perform quite poorly compared to their brick and mortar counterparts. And interestingly, it's actually sort of the first time we've looked at it, because we've always sort of been under the impression that the blended model has tended to be a useful model for a lot of those struggling students, and a way in which we could take the best of that sort of face-to-face brick and mortar instruction and meld it with the best aspects of the flexible kind of environment, and that, to use all of those neoliberal buzzwords, that customized, personalized, individualized kind of, competency-based environment in the online way. But the first time that's ever actually been looked at in a real systematic way was by Gary Murin as part of the annual virtual schooling report that the National Education Policy Center puts out. And he actually found that those blended programs perform at about the same level that those full-time online programs perform, which again is quite miserably compared to a traditional brick and mortar environment. So I think the biggest trend that I see within the U.S. is a growth in these programs, even though they haven't been producing the results that they claim they can. And the only people that are benefiting from it are these advocacy groups and the corporations that are backing them for the most part. The number of the percentage or proportion of students that are actually being served in good ways by these programs are quite small, and in many cases, many of these students would have been served through other means within the educational system.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's interesting. What do you think is causing the miserable assessment, data? I mean, the assessment data that shows the sort of miserable results going on?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with how these programs are organized. For all of their talk about customization and personalization and individualization, it really is a one-size-fits-all model. If you and I were both in a full-time online environment right now, we would both have a teacher that has a student-teacher ratio that's anywhere from 2 to maybe even 5 times the average student-teacher ratio in the classroom environment. You and I would basically start off doing some kind of online assessment. And based upon that online assessment, the artificial intelligence that's built into the learning management system would figure out what we didn't know and give us, in all honesty, some well-designed, from an instructional design perspective, although very behavioralist in terms of its structure. I mean, it is very rote information. I mean, this is like an online thinking machine. Now, it's a very fancy, glitzy, multimedia-based, with all the bells and whistles thinking machine, but it is an online thinking machine. Sort of the Skinnerian thinking machine.
Right, sounds like
in the ed tech kind of world. But if you got, say, 30% of that assessment wrong, and I got 40% wrong, but 20% of what we got wrong was consistent with each other, we would actually get the exact same instruction. The only personalization that actually happens is how much of the instruction you and I do. If we have the same things wrong, we get the exact same instruction. And then we go and do another assessment, and if we get 80% on that assessment, which is what they perceive or what they use as a guide for mastery, then we move on to the next bit. If we don't get 80%, we get another set of content, again, about that stuff that we didn't know. The teachers are basically only there to be on-demand tutors, or if we fail to log in for a period of time, they're required to actually come, and try to cajole us into participating, which is why they're able to have such a high student-teacher ratio, because these folks aren't really teachers. They are sort of tutors in that old correspondence distance ed model that we used to send off the packet and the tutor would grade it. Well, now the tutor doesn't grade stuff. The computer does all that for them. They're just there to answer questions and to basically be like a truant officer. So that's one of the difficulties, I think, is just this. It is a one-size-fits-all model, both in terms of the way in which the curriculum is put together, the structure that's put in place to support students, and the way students are instructed within that model. And that is really done because most of these blended and full-time online programs are being run by for-profit corporations. And anyone who's familiar with sort of a business cycle, the more widgets you can put through based upon a particular dollar figure, the more profitable you are. Well, within the full-time and blended online, within the online and full-time online and blended schooling environment, the students are the widgets. So the more that they can put through with a single teacher, with a single set of curriculum, with a single support kind of structure, that is very profitable to them. And it's one of the reasons why, like K12 Inc., which is the largest of these companies, it's a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange. You can sort of look them up on the ticker. Their stock number is LRN. And, their CEO, they have about 170,000 students, which makes them, a big school district. We're talking, New York City, LA Unified, that kind of size, but their CEO makes, several millions of dollars. Most of their board members are all making $1+ million. And that's just base salary. That doesn't count bonuses in many cases. How many superintendents do you know across the country that are making, $1 million+ on an annual basis, plus having bonuses and stock options and all sorts of other things?
Wow.
That's really what's sort of driving a lot of this. It's one of the reasons why you see that one of the things that the research does show is size of program actually makes a big difference when we're looking at student performance. The smaller the program, the better they tend to perform. And one of the reasons for that is it's a scale thing. If you're looking at a focused group of students and you're trying to address the needs of a specific type of student and you're only interested in that kind of student, you can really tailor a program around that. One of the best examples I always use is there's a program up in Port Huron, Michigan called it's run by the St. Clair County Regional Educational Services Agency, or their RESA there. It's called the Virtual Learning Academy. And they work with students that have been involved in the juvenile justice system. So all of their students are folks that either have been in juvenile detention, some of them in jail, or are just getting out of that kind of environment. Many of these students have been permanently expelled or permanently excluded from the traditional brick and mortar system. Because they're targeting just this group of students, they can look at it and say, okay, for this particular population of students, how can we design a program that is going to cater to their needs? So one of the things that they do is students only take 2 classes at a given time to decrease the number of subjects that they've got to focus upon. So now they'll still complete 6 or 8 or 10 courses throughout the course of a year, but they're only doing 2 at any given time. And if they finished, say they started off doing like a science and a math course, and on the 3rd of November, they finished the science course, they would then get enrolled into, say, a social studies course. And then maybe on the 2nd of December, they finish the math course, and then they get enrolled into an English course. So they're only having to focus upon 2 subject areas at any given time. They have a structure set up where the school is actually open much longer than what a traditional school would be. The hours I know when they first started, I don't know what they exactly are now, but it was oftentimes, an 8 to 8, Monday to Thursday, 8 to 4 on Fridays and Saturdays. There was always a couple of teachers that were in the building available for students to interact with. The students all had their teacher's cell phone numbers. Teachers were assigned students in sort of a homeroom kind of concept. So while the students were taking the courses in an online format, they had a homeroom teacher, if you will, that they were responsible for checking in with. And they were actually required to come to the building for 8 hours a week in 2 separate sittings. But they basically looked at this particular population, said, how can we design a flexible kind of program that's going to meet their needs, not this one-size-fits-all model that a lot of these cyber charters are using, where they're catering to that high-level athlete that can't go to a brick-and-mortar school because they're traveling for competition, or that student that already has some kind of career, as well as the student who was bullied in school and really just doesn't want to go to a brick and mortar environment because of that, or the student that has failed most of their courses 3 and 4 times and are now trying something as an alternative. You can't have one program that caters to those 5 or 6 different types of students.
Right. That sounds ideal, like truly, it makes you wonder what personalized learning means. It depends on who you ask.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing I like about a lot of these smaller programs is, what they're doing is they're saying, we have a certain segment of our students that aren't being served in our traditional brick and mortar kind of environment? How can we think creatively using some of these online tools, in some cases in completely online ways, in some cases in hybrid and blended ways, to really cater to their needs so that we can actually provide them with an education like we are legally required to do?
Right. That's all interesting. I want to explore, I want to learn more. I know you're an expert at this. Has anybody done research talking to students with learning disabilities and how they're doing or not doing well in these programs?
Kind of. There is a federally funded center for, it's actually called the Center for Online Learning Students with Disabilities, based at the University of Kansas. One of the, I will be perfectly frank and say this, that one of the unfortunate things about it was when it was awarded by the Federal Department of Education, there were very few folks that were actually involved in the field of online learning that were part of the initiative. The vast majority of folks that were part of it were special education folks. Because of that, much of the work that they've done for the first 3 or 4 years, and it's only a 5-year project, or at least it's only funded for 5 years, but much of the work that they've done has tended to be descriptive and exploratory, oftentimes learning things that those of us that have been in the field already could have told them in a 15-minute conversation. So unfortunately, while there is this center that's available, they have been doing some work, and some of their more recent work is, I think, starting to get at some of the real issues that need to be tackled in that particular area. But for the most part, much of what they've published to date have been things that you could have read from Kathy Kavanaugh or Margaret Roblier or Tom Clark or Elizabeth Murphy or some of those earlier folks in the field, even before I first got involved with K12 online work.
Gotcha. So there's a need. Okay, that's good to know. Well, thank you. And then my second question's a little different. I guess just mainly focusing on more like non-corporate, but public school, maybe just thinking about, because most of our students, nearly all go into public schools. And most of ours just stay in the area, Dallas, Fort Worth. And so increasingly I'm seeing blended learning is more so in secondary, but also in, elementary. What do we need to be doing to prepare pre-service teachers to kind of hit the ground running, like in your opinion?
Well, it's actually interesting because there's actually been work that's been done in this area now for almost a decade. Nikki Davis, when she was still with Iowa State University, had a federally funded FIPSE grant that actually was entitled Teacher Education Goes into Virtual Schooling. And one of the things that sort of in a conceptual or framework way that she sort of how she structured her particular program was she looked at the idea of, at the time it was just a virtual school teacher, but it applies to both online and blended teachers, regardless if you're in that more corporate model or even in the public school system. It's applicable across the field, I think. But essentially the role of the teacher becomes diffused. In a traditional brick and mortar classroom, I decide, what we're going to learn tomorrow. Now I've got some, objectives and stuff I've got to cover based on, the Common Core and state standards and, oftentimes whatever textbook the school district has decided to buy into or whatever resources they bought into. But in terms of the actual, what happens in the classroom, I'm responsible for designing that on a day-to-day basis. I'm responsible for delivering that on a day-to-day basis. And then I'm responsible for supporting or facilitating the students on a day-to-day basis. When you look at an online or blended kind of model, those three roles really are done oftentimes by three different people. There is oftentimes a specific individual or even a team of individuals that are responsible for designing the asynchronous course content that we use in an online course or in a blended course. Oftentimes teachers just get this stuff. We don't actually create this stuff. There's somebody that actually delivers the instruction either in the room in a blended format, or if it's an online course, there is an online teacher. And then really, the third one is, I think, where most of our teachers need to be, have some facility with, because it's the one that they're most likely to do. For those teachers that have online students at their school that they're not actually teaching, but they're being taught by some online teacher or somewhere else in the world or somewhere else in the state, but the kids are still at my school. Or I've got kids that are taking stuff in a blended fashion. I still need to be able to facilitate and to support what's going on. I mean, those kids that we put in the online class, they just don't go into a computer lab by themselves and just sort of expect to learn. We need to have some sort of school-based kind of support. Oftentimes it's called a mediating teacher or mentor teacher. Some places it's called a virtual school facilitator. But each of those three roles requires different skill set. And, I think for both our pre-service and our in-service teachers, I think we should give them a little bit of both, but a lot on the third. I think our pre-service and in-service teachers that we're working with, I think they should know how not just to evaluate and curate online content, but I think they should have some senses how to create online content on their own. Because while there's a lot of good resources out there, there's oftentimes something about it that just doesn't, address everything that you need. And if they could only do one other thing with these three things I found, it would be perfect. So we need to be able to give our teachers the skills to be able to design that little bit that's missing. So when they curate the other things, it's sort of a complete package for them. We do need to teach our in-service and pre-service teachers how to teach online or teach in a blended format. Not all of them teach in this way, but many of them will. And it gives them an opportunity to decide, if that's something they're interested in. Central Florida University for a long time has actually allowed their students to, it's almost been a decade now, where they've allowed their students to actually do an online student teaching with the Florida Virtual School. It's a partnership they've developed. And one of the interesting things, they survey all of the teachers, or the pre-service teacher candidates, I guess, at the end of their student teaching experience. And for those that have done an online experience, one of the things they ask them is having taught, student taught online, is this something that you might think, you'd like to do for your career? And it's interesting because invariably, about a third of them say, yes, if I had the opportunity, this is the only way I would teach, and I would be happy to do this for the rest of my career. Wow. About a third of them say, well, yeah, I could see myself doing this, but I also enjoyed my face-to-face student teaching. So, I'm happy to go wherever I can get a job kind of model. And about a third of them say, no, I would never teach online. You couldn't pay me enough to teach online, which is interesting because, it gives our teacher education candidates, a really sort of good, metacognitive awareness of, both the strengths and the weaknesses of, and the differences between teaching in an online environment and teaching in a face-to-face environment, and allows them to sort of get a sense as to, is this something that I might like to do?
Yeah, you never know. Yeah.
And then the third thing that I think, and this is really where we need to focus, I think, our attentions for, preparing people to be able to deal with the online and blended environment, is that facilitator role, that mentor role. Right. There's a lot of good work being done in this area. The initial work that Nikki Davis did as part of that teacher education goes into virtual schooling initiative. There's a group up in Newfoundland, Dennis Mulcahy being one of them, that has been at Memorial University of Newfoundland that have been looking at, they've used the term mediating teacher there. There's a fair amount of research coming out of New Zealand looking at the role of the E-Dean, which is the term that they use for that school-based mentor. And most recent, UNC Chapel Hill had a IES grant as part of their National Research Center for Rural Education Support. It's like, I can't remember her first name now, but her last name is Delavere. Matt Irving and Wally Hammond were part of that initiative. But they were looking again at that role of the virtual school facilitator. And then most recently, Jared Borup and the work that he's been doing initially with his dissertation and Mountain Heights Academy in Utah, but more recently with the Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute. They've been doing a fair amount of work looking at, and they use the term virtual school mentor in Michigan. So there's a lot of resources that have been built from these various initiatives. When you're looking at sort of those three roles of the teacher. It's probably the one that's got the most research available, which for us is a great thing, because, one of the difficulties for a lot of what we do with K12 online and blended learning and teacher education is we don't have that much research to guide a lot of the things that we're trying to put together. That idea of how do we prepare our pre-service and in-service teachers to be able to perform that facilitator or that support role. That's one area where we actually have a bit of research that can help guide what we do with, essentially the skills and knowledge and abilities that we provide our, candidates with.
Mm-hmm. I love the mentoring focus. I've been doing some digital mentoring research, action research on my own teaching on using synchronous learning, webinar-based kind of learning through, and so that's been a real interest. And we've drawn on literature like from Murphy and colleagues, the coaching, mentoring, and facilitating kind of roles, and those really make sense to me.
Okay.
And so that's really been helpful. That all resonates with me. That's great. I like the mentoring aspect that you mentioned. Digital.
Yeah, and like I said, it's the one that our teachers are most likely to perform. So it's the one we should probably spend the most time getting them ready for.
That's good. I like that. And then I think too, just being flexible, like the tech support that you might have to give to students and you may not know answers. So knowing how to look that up is also a skill.
But not just that, there's actually, I think, great benefit to, sitting there with a student and muddling your way through something, because, you're sort of verbalizing and going through that critical thinking, problem solving process of how do I, deal with whatever technical issue that I've come up with. And, the students, if they're, if you use that as a teaching moment, I think are quite, helpful, in much the same way that in theory, the virtual school mentor, the facilitator, isn't supposed to be a source of content-based support.
Mm-hmm.
You might be an English teacher and you might have a bunch of students in the back of your room doing credit recovery algebra 1.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that idea of muddling through, trying to figure out the answer to an algebra 1 problem when it may be a decade or 15 years ago since the last math class you took.
Right.
That sort of working it through and trying to figure it out, and, where you go looking to try to get the answers and the help, and how do I do this next step? Again, all of that is, I think, part of how we go about supporting our students.
Mm-hmm.
And, so those are actually just some of the skills that, if you look at some of the research by, the North Carolina Chapel Hill folks, or that Jared has been doing, or that, Dennis Mulcahy or Nikki Davis has been doing, that's actually one of the things that they will talk about. That idea of sort of, they don't use the term muddling through, but I mean, that's really what we're talking about.
Yeah, I call it troubleshooting, but yeah, muddling through, that's a skill. Yeah, it takes time. Well, thank you. I think you've brought up a lot of good points and given some food for thought. Do you have anything else you want to mention?
No, I think that's about it.
Okay, great.